On a good day, you can see the ripraps breaking. The ripraps are a series of tiny submerged islands just off a spot known as Little Islands in Hant's Harbour. Hant's Harbour itself lays on the west side of the Baie de Verde Peninsula, facing Trinity Bay, on the Avalon Peninsula of the island of Newfoundland in the Atlantic Ocean. Just out beyond the ripraps, bearing south, vast, cold, and deep, the currents of the Trinity Bay Gyre spin away from the Greater Labrador Current and pour down the center of the bay, hit the lands at the bottom, and recoil back up along the shore. On their way back, now flowing inside the ripraps, the currents are warmer and slower. Here, fish congregate on these shallow shoals in vast abundance, and this abundance has attracted many migrants to these shores. For centuries, Newfoundland salt cod fed the world, including Wellington's armies as he marched against Napoleon through Spain, then on to Waterloo. And for thousands of years before the white man, the abundance of the ripraps fed the First Nations people. A thousand years before the birth of Christ, during a geological period known as the Priora Oscillation, the water level in Trinity Bay was some 3 meters lower than it is today. This left the Ripraps archipelago fully exposed and accessible. The temperature was 2 to 3 degrees centigrade cooler, which may not seem like much, but in fact had a dramatic impact on the vegetation and consequently the wildlife of the Baie de Verde Peninsula. Today, we see thick boreal forest and extremely dense underbrush. This is what the Europeans would have found when they arrived in the 16th century, and it would have fit their boat-building ways perfectly. However, during the Priora Oscillation, as the maritime archaic peoples were making their way from Labrador into the huge bays of Newfoundland, these first people to discover our shores would have seen a barren, near-desolate landscape. The areas around the ripraps, Little Islands, and the greater Hants Harbour region would have struck these newcomers as a little bit of heaven, for much the same reason Europeans found the place so enticing 2,500 years later. The warm, calm, shallow water was filled with feeding fish, waterfowl, and sea mammals such as seals and walrus, perched or basking respectively in the relative splendor of the Ripraps archipelago. Here, too, much to the first people's pleasure, might have been vast herds of caribou, come to bask and loll in the security and respite of the emergent rocks, safe at last from the ravages of wolves and the incessant indignities of flies. This, at any rate, is what Grant Tucker thinks. That, and a good deal more. A retired teacher, an ongoing student of life, at the age of 70 plus a few, Grant still manages to lead tours into the forests around Hants Harbour to show the curious an elaborate assortment of mysterious stone structures scattered throughout the local woods. The original purpose of these stone structures and who might have built them is still unknown.
Let her rip. Guys are ready to make the trip to the High Altar and the Great Wall. And some interesting features before we begin.
The structures themselves were discovered by Grant and his contemporaries when they were boys, playing cowboys and Indians in the forest. Ever since then, Grant has been puzzled by the origin of the structures. Having grown up in a period where day-to-day physical life was not greatly dissimilar from that of the earliest European settlers, Grant cannot imagine his ancestors having the time or inclination to wrest the stones out of the moss-bound soil through the dense undergrowth to form seemingly pointless piles in the middle of nowhere, relative to the needs of Hants Harbour at the time. Others disagree. The mysterious stone structures around Hants Harbour have attracted a degree of archaeological interest over the years. Provincial archaeologists credit much of the activity to European gardening, wall or road building. They say that the structures Tucker is so fixated on are debris piles from clearing fields for gardens, or piles made to assist in the creation of roads, a vital function in historic rural Newfoundland. Much of the labor was subscribed through government relief projects during tough times, and such practices were common enough around the island, and indeed in the Harbour area.
Yeah, when we say roads, I think anyone talking roads in the early 19th century, it's a footpath, and you might have a course along in a cart, but obviously you read the historic records about the early roads and the road building projects in Newfoundland, they qualify them saying, of course, they're not like the modern roads of today, they're footpaths. And there's the evidence, it's footpaths and roads between pretty much every community on the island.
Much of the archaeologists' argument rests on the resemblance of the Hant Harbour structures to other structures around the island that have been identified as European in origin, if it walks like a duck. Yet when it comes to the Great Wall of Hant Harbour, even the archaeologists admit to being mystified. Tiered gardens? When so much better arable land is readily available? A road to nowhere?
So far.
You certainly wouldn't build a road back here.
No tortures.
No. But I mean, seriously, under these conditions, with a hill?
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, no,
Yeah, where's this road going, right?
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I say Black Wall.
If you go up there and sit with your
North America's first cul-de-sac.
North America's first cul-de-sac.
Not far from Little Islands and the Rip Raps, the last known Beothic in the area made their homes on Custard's Head. In the late 1700s, these people were driven to the sea and massacred by the Europeans. How long they'd made their home here, tucked into the rock crevices against the weather, one wary eye towards inland invaders, the other out to sea towards their sacred fishing grounds and the threat of European frigates, no one knows. Their arrow and spearheads have been found in this location, and the tales of native women being adopted into local families are a painful truth only recently spoken of in polite company. Meanwhile, Grant is not convinced by the archaeologists' arguments. They're putting the cart before the mound, he says. The mound of rocks were either fashioned as reserve piles for the building of cart tracks, or, as Grant argues, the mounds were taken from, cannibalized, to add to the thin forest trails, such as they are. The archaeologists argue there were nowhere near enough maritime archaic people 3,000 years ago to create the structures as Tucker envisages them. Furthermore, they say the maritime archaic first peoples clung strictly to the shoreline, and many of the structures Grant refers to are distinctly inland, especially given the lower sea levels during the period in question, which would have placed these sites further from the water. The observer, at this point, may be excused for feeling ambiguous. The expert's opinion seems to be mounting, and Occam's razor, where the simplest answer is most probably the correct answer, looms ominously over Grant's position. As the party breaks up, Grant is unrepentant. He's been down this road before, a few times, but he doesn't give up easily. Even if the archaeologists are given their due, Grant will tell you that there is still a lot unanswered for. There is a bigger picture, not seen, a picture that carries us back 3,000 years to when the Caribou were thick upon the land, ranging in their tens of thousands up and down the barren Bay de Verde Peninsula. Around the same period, the maritime archaic people had moved south into Trinity Bay area. Colder temperatures had changed their environment, including access to food and other resources. As a younger man, Grant hunted caribou up north. He studied the vast herds as any hunter would, in order to better know and understand the ways of his prey. He came to know, too, the ancient First Nation ways of hunting the caribou, of the long, low stone walls that so attracted the creatures, guided their meanderings across the land, and ultimately herded them into zones where primitive arrows, spears, and brave, patient hearts could be used to the most lethal effect. The caribou drive lanes of the north were, and still are, huge complexes, mazes really, of stone walls cunningly laid to take advantage of the natural elevations, prevailing winds, and natural dispositions of the caribou themselves, all combined and contrived to funnel the creatures into highly specific kill zones, where they could be slaughtered en masse to provide the people with the very elements of survival in the unforgiving barrens of the north. What guided Grant to his conclusions about the multitude of stone structures and mounds in and around the Hants Harbour area were the characteristics of the caribou themselves. A dominant feature of the caribou's physiology is its buoyancy. To look at the beast, one would not leap to such a conclusion. Squat, awkward seeming even, the caribou is remarkably well suited to swimming, and there is a very good reason for this. The caribou's hair follicles are hollow, so that its hide acts like a life jacket. Its widely splayed hooves act as well as paddles, thrusting the beast gamely forward through any water obstacles. And these permutations are not by mere chance. They are a distinct and vital series of survival mechanisms. The bane of the caribou are twofold. Primarily, there are wolves who dog the herd, incessantly tearing away the weak, feeble, sick, and old in a snarling fury of fangs and blood. Then there are the flies that burrow into the caribou skin and lay their eggs, which ultimately hatch and burst forth through the caribou's hide, a torment that can only be imagined. The solution to both these afflictions is to take to the water, which, as we have seen, the caribou is well suited to. Imagine then the animal's relief upon leaving the interior of the island, where forage was more readily available, but as the heat of the spring brought forth the bugs and the starving packs of wolves, flight to the cool breezes and inviting waters of the shoreline would be seen as nearly irresistible. And so it was, for millennia, that the Bay de Verde herd migrated up and down the peninsula in their endless rotation of life and death, possibly breaching the landlock in the spring and again in the fall, surging over the soft, swaying hills on the gradual approach to Hants Harbour, and down through the creeks and saddles on their determined, near desperate approach up through Custard's Head, down through little islands, and finally springing into the heavenly brine and fleeing to the island sanctuary of the Rip Raps, there to breathe and gasp again in peace at last. At least that's how Grant sees it, and as we look at his mounds of stones and wall-like structures strewn about, it begins to make a strange kind of sense. It fits into a bigger picture, where the caribou and the maritime archaic people converge. Grant believes there was a maritime archaic people's base camp situated in the Hants Harbour area, and his reasoning is derived from the archaeological community itself. Let us travel now across the land through time and imagination on the way of the caribou. Renowned archaeologist, the late Dr. Priscilla Renouf, postulated that a maritime archaic base camp would likely be situated in the middle of the peninsula or bay arm, with local heights sufficient to monitor the movement of animal resources across the land and sea. Such a base would have an abundance of resources in the area. Renouf did not discredit the notion that such a base, or its various components, would necessarily be limited to the shoreline. That more structures have not been found further inland is not to say they don't exist, argued Renouf. It argues only that they have not been found. The notable absence of any such finds, she suggested, was the stubborn and impenetrable nature of the Newfoundland brush, making it difficult to locate the sites. Grant imagines the herd picking along, not as a tangled, frothing mass, but as discrete groups following along in an incessant, laconic stream. The prehistoric hunters would have arrayed themselves along the heights, cautiously signaling ahead the movements of their quarry to beaters and hunters alike, ever careful not to startle the plodding caribou, the creatures themselves hyper-attenuated to the merest gesticulation that would set them instantly on the run. The prevailing southwest winds in Hants Harbour favored the hunters, putting them generally upwind from their prey. The contours of the land itself acted to steer the caribou along the kindly grades that distinguish Hants Harbour from other points along the coast. The caribou's splayed hooves are finicky things, disinclined from stony or otherwise treacherous footing or abrupt, sheer inclines. In Grant's mind, the first kill zone lies here, in a bowl of land behind Hants Harbour's heritage wharf. He is eager to point out where the remains of the stone walls figure into the landscape, where he sees what might have been the prehistoric stone drive lanes that connived to force the caribou down to the beach and the water, where they'd be netted and speared as they floundered. Despite their buoyancy, the caribou would lose a lot of speed and momentum in the water, where they'd naturally free for safety and become easy pickings for the people in simple canoes.
You see pieces of rock down there, look.
Mm-hmm.
You see, look,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Between the fence posts.
There's rock down there.
Solid rock there.
Meeting into this natural feature.
Right. Grant argues that the primitive stone walls, put in place 3,000 years ago to drive caribou, were later taken from by European settlers to serve another purpose, to create the garden walls and foundations that now litter the area. As for the caribou themselves, those not ensnared in these devious contrivances fled either west, up towards the Great Wall, or north towards Custer's Head, Little Islands, and their ultimate destination, the Rip Raps Archipelago. It's difficult to imagine this terrain barren, but it's necessary to understand Grant's way of thinking, if so much stone was to be so easily moved, or indeed moved at all. Based on what we know of the early European experience in this area, Grant says they would have been far too busy fishing, hunting, or gathering wood for their winter fires to indulge in such folly as creating piles of stones for a venture with no clear purpose or destination. The maritime archaic peoples, on the other hand, living in a barren landscape, would have had all the reason in the world to do as their forebears had done for thousands of years, build low stone walls to drive caribou. Development of the drive lanes complex was not necessarily rapid. The changes to terrain, brought by the prior oscillation, lasted hundreds of years, plenty of time for early First Nations peoples to build up the area. We know that traditionally these native people practiced scaffold or elevated burials, so the bodies of their kin would be free from predation. But once the bones were clear of flesh and ready to be smeared with ritual ochre and transported, these nomadic peoples gathered the remains of their family members and brought them for final interment in stone mounds, mounds that appear with peculiar abundance in and around the Hant's Harbour area, mounds that would designate a permanence in the afterlife. Either fleeing the lower kill zone or directed in from the interior of the island, many caribou would come to ultimate grief here. As any rancher or cowpoke knows, bovines have a peculiar fondness for fences. Cattle of all stripes and hue naturally follow walls, no matter how humble or diminutive, and will do so for miles to the bitter end. First Nations caribou hunters have used this to their advantage since the dawn of time, on this continent and any other continent where caribou or their ilk roam in perpetuity. First Nations people took this thinking to another level. They recognized where man-like shapes, Inukshuk, appear, the caribou will come up short and mill about confusedly, perfectly poised for the hunter to emerge from low trenches dug behind walls to fall amongst their prey with deadly and fearsome precision. Those animals not caught in the first two kill zones would hastily make their way to the safety of high ground, as instinct dictates, or flee ever onward toward the sanctuary of the water. Animals moving to the high ground would enter the high kill zone behind Soper's Hill. Here, evidence of ancient stone walls appear yet again, in congruence with the swerve and buckle of the terrain, as if thwarting the beasts with their own wall-following proclivities to this, and a rapid descent to death. Coincidence? Perhaps, yet the trail out to Little Islands, with its lone stone walls, and numerous odd mounds and other strange stone configurations, only conspires with Grant's theory to bring the observer, if not to a conviction, then to a certain kind of doubt that not everything is so obviously what it seems to be. What makes the trek to Little Islands so haunting is the sense of isolation the stretch of coast engenders. The hominess of Hant's Harbour is soon left behind, and a vagrant loneliness grips the soul. Out here, on the edge of the sea, men and women huddled against the wilderness to eke out a survival so rugged and isolated they might as well have been on the moon. The solitary character of this place is palpable, and it's through these narrow confines, against low-slung walls, that Grant believes the Caribou moved inexorably towards their final destination. Any point on the path could have been an ambush, and there are stone features squirreled away in these forlorn woods that make absolutely no sense in a historic European context. The first of these is what Grant refers to as the fox trap. The mechanics are pure deviousness. Meat bait draws the fox into a tiny stone amphitheater. He jumps down in, and the walls are too high for him to jump back out. The stone stop on the chute at the end of the trap is removed by the hunter, who reaches in and breaks the creature's neck with his bare hands. None too dainty, but brutally effective, and not European. The Europeans would have used wood or metal, and such stone fox traps are well known and provenly exclusive First Nations construction. At long last, the tour emerges into the vestibule of Little Islands, just shy of the shore and the ripraps. Here an oddly huge stone pile lies in a state of disarray. Grant calls it the Rock Igloo, and believes it bears a resemblance to similar Inuit structures further north in Labrador. The European population of Little Islands at its peak would have been hard-pressed to build this mound, and why would they have even done it? Yet maritime archaic First Peoples lived in structures much akin to what this collapsed mound might have once been. And, as the Europeans discovered over 2,000 years later, in this very spot, with the fish and the aquatic wildlife of the ripraps, and this being the terminus of the long way of the Caribou, Little Islands, and its infinitely lonely Rock Igloo may well have been a rough-hewn seat on the very doorstep of Nirvana.
They sort of threw up their hands and said, "We really don't know what
We
this
don't
is."
know what this is.
Oh, I see.
No, neither do we know.
We don't know what it is.
Yeah.
We think we.
We've got some
Yeah.
idea of what it could be.
We're only guessing.